Hey everybody, hey now! Welcome to Season 2 of Clearing Confusion, the show where I talk about confusing things having to do with video games, and hopefully clear it all up. Today I want to talk about a series that is a big favorite of mine, and I consider it to be among the quintessential action RPGs. No, it's not Zelda. Stop asking about Zelda. I'll get to it when I get to it. I'm talking about the Ys series. Now, there's a slight chance that you haven't heard of it, or if you have, you may either be surprised to know the series is still going, or you may be surprised to find out that it goes back a long way. The wonderful thing about Ys is that there's very little confusion when it comes to the timeline. Most of the games just take place after the previous ones, and they all star the same character, Adol. However, there are multiple versions of each game on several different systems. Some of the games hadn't come out in America in their original forms, others not at all, and worst of all, some of the remakes have different titles than the original versions and aren't numbered. One thing that you should know is that the series is developed by Nihon Falcom, but has been through various publishers. These days, it seems most likely to be published by either Xseed Games or Atlas, which is fine because Atlas friggin' rocks. Though the series started out on PC, these days you'll find nearly all of them on the PSP. Actually, out of the core series, there's only 2 that aren't on the PSP, and one of those is coming out for the Vita sometime next year. And if the second one also comes out for the Vita, it means we'll be able to play the entirety of the Ys series on the Vita and PSP systems. But the question comes, what order do you play them in, and where can you find the original versions? Well, let's take a look. The original game's full title is Ys 1 Ancient Ys Vanished, though some of the re-releases had different titles, such as Ys the Vanished Omens, or The Ancient Land of Ys. You might be surprised to know that the original game's inspiration was none other than the notorious PC and NES title Hydlide. It has some similar mechanics for combat and leveling, but is a lot more polished with better controls, graphics, and gameplay, and most notably the music was great in Ys, whereas in Hydlide, it just repeated the same short song over and over again. You know the one that sounds almost exactly like the Indiana Jones theme song. Ys 1 Ancient Ys Vanished was released for PCs and only in Japan, though back then releasing a game for PCs was a lot more complicated than it is today. Today you pretty much have Windows and Mac, but back then there were so many different PCs and operating systems. Ys was released originally on the PC 8801, and then it was ported to the X1, the PC 9801, the FM7, FM77, and the FM77AV. Its first appearance on a gaming PC was on the MSX2. It then made the jump to consoles, appearing on the Japanese version of the NES, the Famicom. Next, it showed up on the Sega Master System. This one is interesting because there's 2 versions, one for the Sega Mark III and another for the Master System, which was pretty much the same hardware, just rebranded. It was also notable for being the first of only 3 standalone versions of the original Ys to be released in America, and the only one on a console. So if you were an American wanting to play the original game on a console, you had to have the Sega Master System. And of course, that's the one with the funky title. It's called Ys the Vanished Omens. The next version came out for DOS, and this one also came out in America, though under the title The Ancient Land of Ys. So if you're looking for that one, that's the title you want. An identical version also came out for the Apple II GS. The next one was for the X68000 gaming computer in Japan, which is the first standalone version to be considered a remake, though it only really changes the boss graphics, which is kind of weird looking, as the boss graphics looked much more modern than anything else in the game. The next version was for Windows, which was called Ys Eternal, which was more of a proper remake. It came out in the US, and it's notable for having full animated cutscenes. Later on, the Windows version of Ys became part of a package with its sequel, and I'll talk about those in a bit. But after that, they started selling them separately again, only this time the game is called Ys Complete. So you might wonder, what's the difference between Ys Eternal and Ys Complete? Actually, there's no difference at all. It's the same exact game. What made things even more confusing was that even though the marketing and game packaging said Ys Complete, the game's title screen said Ys Eternal, leading a lot of people to believe they had mistakenly gotten the wrong, older version of the game and not the newer, enhanced version that they were expecting. However, it really was just the old game in a new box. To make up for this, and to try to ease some of the confusion, there are fan-made patches for Complete, which change the title screen to say Complete instead of Eternal. So, even though it's two separate releases, it's literally the same game data, so I refer to them as being one version. The next one is sort of a bundle, though it's unique, so I'll talk about it here. Usually when I say bundle, I mean Ys 1 and Ys 2 together, but in this case, you could get Ys on the Sega Saturn, along with two other Nihon Falcom games, Dragon Slayer and Xanadu. This was Falcom Classics Volume 1, which only ever came out in Japan. The last standalone remake of Ys was on the Nintendo DS, also only in Japan. This version updated quite a lot, giving the game a new 3D graphics, as well as new gameplay which forced Adol to have to swing his sword, rather than merely bumping into enemies like the previous ones. The next game is a direct sequel, taking place right after the cliffhanger ending of the original game. The full title of it is Ys 2 Ancient Ys Vanished, the Final Chapter. Now keep in mind, it would of course not be the final chapter, but rather the final chapter of the Ancient Ys Vanished storyline. The gameplay was very much the same, only adding the addition of spells to the game. Like the original, Ys 2 was initially developed for the PC 8801, but then wound up friggin' everywhere. A lot of the same PCs that the original came out on, such as the PC 9801, the X1 Turbo, the FM77AV, and the MSX2. A Famicom version also came out, and once again it was not ported to the American NES. The later PC versions can get a little confusing. Like with the original, there was a DOS version, although it had almost nothing to do with the first DOS version, which had come out in America. This one was called Ys 2 Special, which was not released in America, and believe it or not, it was not released in Japan either. Instead, it came out exclusively in South Korea. What's nuts is, this could be the best PC version of Ys 2. It has a lot of added content and secrets, and full, long anime cutscenes which are actually taken from the anime adaptation of the game, Castle in the Heavens. It did really well in South Korea, but it never came out anywhere else. Luckily, there was a Windows version, and like the first game, this was the same confusion, with the two versions that were the same thing, Ys 2 Eternal and Ys 2 Complete. Just think of them as one game that has two boxes. Ys 2 also came out on the Saturn as a part of Falcom Classics Volume 2, along with another unrelated game, Taiyo no Shinden Astika 2. And finally, on the DS, much in the vein of the original. The Saturn and DS versions only came out in Japan, so basically, out of all the ones I mentioned, the only versions of the first game to come out in Japan were the Master System, DOS, and Windows versions, and for Ys 2, it was only Windows. Kinda sad, but don't worry, it's about to get better. After Ys 2 came out, and because it finishes the story that the first game left hanging, it became a common practice to release the two together, to the point where it's actually more common to see them together than apart. The first time this happened was on the PC Engine CD-ROM, and it was called simply Ys 1 and 2. This one happily came to America on the American counterpart, the TurboGrafx CD, and it was called Ys Books 1 and 2. This is probably the most well-known version of the first game and the second game, so much so that a lot of people assume that the series started on the TurboGrafx and are surprised to know that it's older than that and started on PC. The reason for this confusion and the TurboGrafx CD version's popularity is probably that after a while they started including Ys Books 1 and 2 as a pack-in title for the TurboGrafx CD. Remember those Windows versions, Ys Eternal and Ys 2 Eternal? Well, they were also packaged together, Ys 1 and 2 Complete. And then, of course, they were stupidly sold separately, but they kept Complete in the title. I personally think that it's insanely stupid. For example, a kid could tell their parents that they want Ys 1 and 2 Complete, and then the parents go to the store and see Ys Complete and they get that. not knowing that it's only half of what the kid wanted. Oh well. Ys 1 and 2 next showed up together on the PlayStation 2 as Ys 1 and 2 Eternal Story. This one was only ever in Japan. Next, the TurboGrafx CD version of Ys Books 1 and 2 was released on the Wii's Virtual Console, and even in America, which is a happy surprise. Another happy surprise is the DS remakes. Remember the ones with 3D graphics and gameplay where you get to swing your sword around? Those were put together on one DS card and released exclusively together in America as The Legacy of Ys Books 1 and 2. This version even came with the full soundtrack for both games. How did we get the better version on one DS card in America and Japan had to buy them separately? And we got the soundtrack? Atlas, bitches. Lastly, the two were released for the PSP as Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles. Unlike the DS game that had already come out, it uses 2D sprites and has the old-style bumping mechanic for combat, but it features high-res graphics and a remix soundtrack, and the option to use the sounds and/or graphics of the Windows versions. Nuts, huh? Also, I think the DS one is the total package with updated gameplay and a soundtrack, but I had to own the PSP one because I have them all on PSP. Go figure. And believe it or not, there's one more thing. The PSP version actually came out for Windows, although only in Japan. Jeez, just talking about the first two games is enough for a full episode of Clearing Confusion, but we got more to go. The next game in the series is Ys 3 Wanderers from Ys. This one is sometimes considered to be the black sheep in the family because it uses a side-scrolling view, kind of like Zelda 2. Actually, it's a lot like Zelda 2, especially since it's the only one in the series to do this, and a lot of people look down on it for that, but it has its defenders, of course. Hell, when I tell people about Ys, I just tell them it's like Zelda with heavy metal. Anyway, Ys 3, like the first two games, was originally on the PC 8801, and then came out for the PC 8901, the MSX2, and the Sharp X68000. Of course, those were all only in Japan. Ys 3 next showed up on both the Famicom and the Super Famicom. The Famicom version stayed in Japan, but the Super Famicom version actually did come out for the Super NES in America. It's an obscure game to be sure, but you can actually get it for your Super NES. It also came out for the Sega Genesis. And yep, that also came out in America. I'm not sure, but I think the Genesis version might be easier to find than the Super NES one. The next version was for the TurboGrafx CD, and this one also came out in America, so hey, woot. The last traditional version of Ys 3 came out for PlayStation 2. This version was published by Taito, and instead of being old school, it actually featured new high-res graphics, which I would have been all over, but unfortunately a planned US release never happened, and it's Japan only. Later on, a complete remake of the game came out for Windows. This one was called Ys: The Oath in Felghana. This one's notable for having the same exact story as Ys 3, but completely different gameplay. It returned to the traditional top-down view, and was very much based on the sixth game in the series. Unfortunately, the Windows version never came out in America, but happily, the PSP version did. But unfortunately, it doesn't have a number in the title, so when you go get your Ys games for the PSP, it can get confusing. But just so you know, this is Ys 3. And now is where it gets really insane. There are actually two completely separate versions of Ys 4. No, I don't mean that there was one on one system and one on another system. And no, I don't mean that one is a remake of the other. I mean that they are literally two completely different games made by different people. That's right, two separate development teams were both separately making a game called Ys 4. And get this, both versions of Ys 4 take place after Ys 2, but before Ys 3. And that is the sound of everybody's head exploding. The really nutty part is that neither version was developed by Nihon Falcom, and neither was on PC. No, wait, the really, really nutty part is that even though fans will forever argue over which one really counts, they both tell the same basic story. No, wait, the really, really, really fucking nutty part is that not only did both games come out in the same year, but they came out only 33 days apart. What the funkin' Wagnalls? Well, they both came out in 1993, but let's talk about the first one. Ys 4 Mask of the Sun came out in November for the Super Famicom. Unfortunately, it never came out in America for the Super NES. What's even more unfortunate is that the only other version of the game was a remake for PlayStation 2 called Ys 4 Mask of the Sun A New Theory, which also only ever came out in Japan. So there's literally no way to play this, though the silver lining is that there is a fan-made translation for the Super Famicom version. Mask of the Sun was developed by Advanced Communication for the Super Famicom and Arc System Works for the PS2. Like I said, Nihon Falcom just chose not to make a Ys 4 and instead skipped straight to 5. The other Ys 4, the one that came out a month later, was called Ys 4 The Dawn of Ys. This one only ever came out on the PC Engine Super CD-ROM and only in Japan, so unfortunately no TurboGrafx CD version for us. And what's really sad is that Dawn of Ys was never remade, so unless you own a Japanese PC Engine and the CD add-on and the Japanese game, and you could read Japanese, you're not going to play this one. This one was developed by Hudson Soft. So which is the real 4? Well, according to most fans, the Dawn of Ys is a superior game, but most people consider Mask of the Sun to be the one that actually counts. But in my opinion, neither of them counts. There is no Ys 4, because neither of them was developed by Nihon Falcom. Thankfully, there's a third version of the game coming out next year, and this one is actually developed by Nihon Falcom. The title is Ys Calcida, Sea of Trees for the PlayStation Vita. Since the title is still in development and the hardware it's coming out on isn't even out yet, we don't know for sure whether or not it's coming out in America, but my hope is that it is, as the Ys series has seen a surge of popularity here on the PSP. Hell, I know I'll buy it if it comes out. All I can tell you is that Nihon Falcom wants it to come out, but that they're in talks with the publisher Xseed Games. If the Vita version of Ys 4 comes out, that will bring us one step closer to having the entire series in English and one step closer to having the entire thing for PlayStation portable consoles. But not completely done, because of the next title. Nihon Falcom returned with the next game in the series, Ys 5 Kethin the Lost City of Sand. While Ys 3 was a weird Zelda 2 side-scrolling game, and Ys 4 wasn't even made by the same company, this one sort of takes it back to its roots, but it goes beyond that, as you're once again made to actually swing your sword, and now you can jump. The overall gameplay is pretty pleasing, and it's very, very much similar to the Zelda games. The game was released for the Super Famicom, and it stayed in Japan, which is sad. It's extra sad because Ys 5 is considered by those who've played it to be a masterpiece and one of the best games in the series, and rendered even more sad by the fact that there isn't even a fan translation released yet. There's a current project that is said to be about 80% complete, but no working beta of the patch has been released, and I haven't heard any news about it since about March, so who knows if it'll ever come out. For the lucky Japanese players who did get to play it, the only complaint about Ys 5 was its difficulty. The game was said to be extremely easy, posing almost no challenge at all, and this is surprising for a series generally known to be challenging. To answer this, Nihon Falcom re-released the game a year later, still on the Super Famicom, with upgraded difficulty as Ys 5 Expert. The only remake of Ys 5 was on the PlayStation 2, but unfortunately, once again, only in Japan. This is the only game in the series that cannot be played in English at all, not even an unofficial fan translation. So like I said, hopefully in a few years we'll see it pop up on the Vita. Next up we have the sixth game, although no version of it is numbered, unfortunately. This one is called Ys the Ark of Napishtim. The original version came out for the PC, and for a long time it was exclusive to both the PC and to Japan. 2 years later, it came out on the PlayStation 2, and hallelujah, the damn game came out in America. Good luck finding it, though. Seriously, this game is seriously hard to find. It's out there, but it's just insanely rare. Luckily, a year after the PS2 version, it was released again for the PSP, and also, once again, it came out in America. And this time it's a bit more common, at least I was able to get a copy of it. Lastly, it was released yet again for PC, this time to be compatible with Windows Vista, but the PC version remained exclusive to Japan. The E-Series doesn't have a lot of spin-offs. Actually, it only has 2, and they're up next. The first spin-off is Ys Origin, and is actually a prequel to the entire series, taking place several hundreds of years before the first game. The game is very similar in gameplay to Ark of Napishtim, but of course you don't play as Adol, as he wasn't even close to being born yet. This is the only game in the series to come out only on PC, though it had 2 releases, a limited edition and a regular one. It also only came out in Japan. This one, I don't really feel too bad about missing out on it. Even though I'm sure it's great, it's not part of the Adol story, so I'm okay with not playing it, though I hope to see it here in America one day. The next game was another spin-off, Ys Strategy for the DS. This is the only game in the series to not be an action-based RPG, but rather a real-time strategy game, though it does star Adol. I don't know much about it. I assume it probably takes place after Ark of Napishtim, but I have no way of knowing for sure, and I was unable to find the info. Actually, it probably isn't considered official anyway, as it was developed by Future Creates and not Nihon Falcom. Ys Strategy never came out in America, though it did come out in Europe, so you can get it in English for the DS with the proper flash card. Finally, Nihon Falcom came back with the next game in the series, Ys 7. That's right, 7, with no subtitle, even though the last one was just a subtitle. And the 7 is spelled out. Oh well, this game rules, so I can't complain about the title. Seriously, this game fucking rocks ass. Ys 7 was exclusive to the PSP and came out in America. The only weird thing about it is that in Europe it's a download-only title. So, that's the Ys series so far. So far there's no news yet on an Ys 8, though right now I'm anticipating the possibility of a finally official version of 4 on the Vita, another reason that this system is going to rule. Join me next time and we'll talk about another obscure series that's a favorite of mine.